Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, 2SLGBTQ plus inclusion in student records. I'm Michael Woodford. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm really glad to welcome you here today. I would like to start with a territorial land acknowledgement, and I invite you to think about the lands in which you are located on and the treaties that apply. We respectfully acknowledge the territories on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of many Indigenous peoples. As a Newfoundlander, I acknowledge that the lands on which I was raised are the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and I acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Inuit, Innu, and Inuit of Newfoundland and Labrador. My workplace, the Faculty of Social Work at Laurier, is situated on the lands traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. These lands are within the Haldimand Tract Treaty of 1784, a formally ratified agreement acknowledging 6 miles on either side of the Grand River as treaty territory belonging to 6 nations of the Grand River. Unequivocally, this treaty promised that the tract of lands 6 miles deep on each side of the Grand River from the river's mouth to its source was to be enjoyed by the 6 nations and their prosperity forever. However, soon after the treaty was signed, it was broken. Today, 6 nations of the Grand River lands comprise less than 5% of what was originally granted. This is just one example of broken promises, injustices, and oppression of colonization for 6 nations, a history for Indigenous communities found across Turtle Island. The harms of Indigenous expulsion and assimilation are many and are being felt in Indigenous communities today. As treaty people and beneficiaries of colonization, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and understand the history and the experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples today. This understanding should shape our work as we strive toward both stopping the damages of colonization and working toward repair. Understanding this context, I invite us to collectively acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous peoples with whom we, who are settlers, share this land today. In doing so, we strive for respectful relationships with all peoples across the land as we support collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Finally, we have a responsibility to honor all our relations and as settlers support Indigenous self-governance. I invite us to implement the calls of actions outlined by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and to support decolonization on our campuses and in our practices and relations. Thank you very much. In terms of our process today, we will be having periods where we're going to be inviting some questions of our panelists, and we really look forward to your questions. We invite you to use the Q&A feature if you type your question there, and then we'll moderate and be able to respond to as many as possible. You will find that feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will be monitoring it throughout and such as well. Additionally, if you need to utilize closed caption, that feature has been enabled, and you can just click the closed caption option to start viewing closed captioning on your screen. So this webinar is part of the Thriving on Campus project, which I've had the pleasure of leading for the past couple of years. We call it a change project because it was certainly more than a study in and of itself. It actually started with a very comprehensive campus-wide, or province-wide survey that looked at the experiences and perceptions and also the well-being and the academic outcomes of 2SLGBTQ students. The survey was conducted in 2019, and then we continued to do interviews into 2019 and 2020, while taking a little break as the pandemic started, but continued those interviews later that spring. Throughout Thriving, we've always had a commitment to making change. So if you look at our website, you will find a series of webinars that go back to the early days of Thriving. Soon after we collected data from the survey, we did our first webinar to share some of those results to try to spur some conversations on campuses. But we also were funded to do a knowledge mobilization and dissemination project, which central to that was a virtual conference series, which many of you may have participated in last year. And that was a 3-day series that happened throughout the academic year last year, which was really featuring learning and action, including the opportunity to collaborate with colleagues from one's university, but also across the sector through various discussion groups and work groups. And I would say that today's work session really came out of some of the early conversations then that continued then throughout this past year with our campus contacts. So every campus has an individual who's a contact or a coordinator for some of the work on their campus for thriving. And amongst that group, the issue of name change policies and practices came up as a common priority. And just the learning as people were talking about their own experiences was quite rich. So if you haven't had a chance to look at our Thriving on Campus website, I invite you to do so. 2 seminal pieces of work that are there are our community reports, which present findings from both the survey and the interviews. And you'll find a series of those reports, including 2 that focus on experiences of racialized 2SLGBTQ students and also disabled 2SLGBTQ students. And then we also have a series of webinars that are there, including keynote addresses from last year's Thriving on Campus virtual conference series as well. So really wonderful resources, and please, we welcome any feedback you might have. So turning to what we're doing today, we are really focusing on name change processes. So we're going to be looking at what are the processes that are in place, and my colleague Eric is going to be presenting on that. Also talking about and spurring some ideas around what responsive policies and practices might entail. And then we're going to learn from colleagues from Brock University about their name change trigger system, which was developed to essentially facilitate comprehensive name changes throughout the university record system. And so avoiding when students, for example, are going to be addressed by their former name that they used and such. So we'll be learning about that. So a bit of a case study. So I'm very much looking forward to that conversation that we have. In terms of our agenda, you'll see where we have a general plan that we're going to be following. We'll be starting with Eric, who will be introducing and providing an overview of some of the data from Thriving on Campus, but also an environmental scan and presenting the results of that. We'll open up the space for some questions, and then we'll move on to hearing from our colleagues at Brock, and again, some time for questions and such as well. So my job in terms of the Q&A is to moderate those things, and so we'll be able to follow along in that way. And then we'll have a wrap up and some thank yous and such. So again, really glad to be here. Really wonderful that we have so many people here, and we will be sharing this recording on the Thriving on Campus, website in a few weeks as well, and be able to share the slides as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who's going to get his slides up. While Eric is doing that, I have the pleasure of introducing Eric. So Eric J. Van Giessen uses he, they pronouns. Eric is a 5th-year doctoral student in sociology at York University. His SSHRC-funded dissertation research examines the lived experiences of LGBTQ+ Christians, specifically delving into how queer self-conceptions intersect with spirituality and lived religion. Eric worked with the Thriving on Campus project since 2019, first as an interviewer and then a research assistant and project coordinator, helping to organize our knowledge mobilization efforts through our Connection project last year and into this year. So thank you so much, Eric, for being with us, and over to you.
Thanks, Michael. So it's my pleasure, as Michael shared, to be talking us through some of the background research that informs some of the discussion we're going to be having today, as well as a brief scan that we did of public-facing processes and procedures that students can access regarding name changes at their particular universities. Give me one sec, sorry. So There are various reasons why students might want to change their names or gender markers on either their official academic records, for instance, transcripts, or campus records like their student ID, Brightspace, Moodle, those sorts of platforms. For some trans students, it might be important to do so in order to reflect the name that they use in their day-to-day life, as well as their gender identity. So before we jump into the scan that we did, I want to briefly highlight some of the findings from the Thriving on Campus survey that speak to the importance of this topic. And as Michael mentioned, through our virtual conference series, we were able to work with registrars and people from student records who spoke about some of the challenges with name change policies and procedures, as well as working closely with the campus contacts from those universities who've continued to bring up this conversation as a point of continuing learning and challenge, particularly around students still being dead named or having their previous name used in university communications or databases, even once those name change processes have been gone through by a student. So before we do that, I just want to point out some of the background research. This is from 2019-2020, when we asked students about their awareness of name change processes, as well as how user-friendly that was and how accessible it is. So just to start, we asked students whether they thought that name changes were possible at their university in regards to either official academic records, again, that's transcripts and those sorts of things, or campus records, student ID, et cetera, et cetera. And 32% of trans students thought that name changes were possible at their institution. And 30% of trans students thought that gender marker changes were possible at their institution. It was even lower for 28% of trans students thinking that name changes were possible within their campus records, and 36 trans students thought their gender marker changes were possible at their institution. If we look at how easily accessible these students thought the process was, and if they did undergo that process, how user-friendly it was, less than half of trans students agreed that the name change process at their institution was easily accessible for both official academic records and campus records. And for those who did go through the process, only 67, 65 for official and campus records found that process user-friendly. And those stats are even lower in regards to the accessibility and user-friendliness of gender marker changes in both of those forms of records. And then lastly, just to comment that there are cisgender students that also choose to change their name on their records. So only 22 out of 23 cisgender students found changing their name on official academic records user-friendly, and 51 out of 70 cisgender students found that process user-friendly for campus records. All of this to say, with the background of the information we've heard from people in student records and our campus contacts and this data, we can see that there's quite a lot of room for growth in this process, either in terms of making this information accessible to students, or making the process itself quite easy, or just general awareness that this process is accessible or exists at their university for students to make use of in their attempts to sort of avoid being dead named at their university. So I'm going to shift now to the scan that we did of public-facing policies and procedures provided to university students who are looking to change their name. I'll just say briefly that we're not experts in the legal considerations or background of some of these policies, and that we looked exclusively at the information that we could find that was publicly accessible on university websites, PDFs that were findable through Google search, those sorts of things. So if there's more information available to students once they register, or to reach out specifically to registrar's offices, that's not the information we were looking for or looking at, just the public facing stuff. So we're going to report what we found by presenting two scenarios to you. The first one where a student has legally changed their name and the process that they undergo to change, to inform a university about that legal name change. And then the second scenario being where a student has not legally changed their name, but would like to declare a chosen or preferred name to be used by the university. And while policies and procedures are the same across universities in Ontario for scenario one, or largely the same, there's two kind of distinct directions or policy procedure choices that universities have made in Ontario in regards to students who are going through scenario number two. And then we'll briefly go over a short list of advantages and disadvantages of each and make some recommendations. So I'll start with scenario one. So scenario one is where a student has legally changed their name and have submitted the appropriate forms. Now I'm just going to read through a bit of an example to talk about what it looks like for a student to go through this. So if I was going to change my name, my given name at birth is Eric Van Giessen. I would go through the appropriate processes to change my legal name to Taylor Van Giessen. When I have a piece of government ID that proves that change, I can report that to my university using their legal, official, or primary name change process. I'll say that presumably when I do this, this change filters down through the student platforms, including Student Card, Brightspace, Moodle, Google, Zoom, my email, those sorts of things. It's unclear in the information provided to students in many cases whether reporting the legal name change will effectively change that name across platforms, or whether the student has additional work to do to comprehensively change their name. Some universities lay out sort of a step-by-step that the students need to go through in order to comprehensively change that themselves, while others might refer students to a 2SLGBTQ student advisor who will help them with that process, etc. The thing that I'll highlight here is that even in this case, in regards to the legal name change, an effective trigger system that distributes that information to the various databases used by a university is really important to prevent students from being dead named by a department that hasn't been informed about the name change they've undergone. So now we'll go to scenario two, which is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So in this scenario, just as a reminder, the students have not changed their legal name, but want to declare a chosen or preferred name to the university. So some universities, there's sort of two paths that universities have taken in this scenario. So some of those, which we'll call University A, have a legal name change process and one for a chosen preferred name. Okay, so they still have two name change processes available. However, a comprehensive or system-wide name change is only possible once a student has legally changed their name. So a student can change their name within campus record systems, so those that don't rely on a SIN number, like Student Card, class list, learning platforms like Brightspace and Moodle, but it won't change their name on official university records such as transcripts, financial information, et cetera, et cetera. So in most cases, when universities take this process, it's referred to as a chosen or preferred name change. And sometimes it's only limited, it's limited to the student's first name that they'll change. Students who go in, or sorry, universities that go in this direction sometimes mention a third option, which is called a statutory declaration that involves a notary or the student hiring legal representation. And this allows a student to change their name officially within their official university records without undergoing a legal name change with the government. So that's scenario one, and I'll just give you an example of what this looks like for a student. So again, my current legal name is Eric Van Giessen. I now refer to this as my dead name. My chosen or preferred name is Taylor Van Giessen. While I cannot change my name with official academic records, the registrar's office, and any other SIN affiliated records, communications and the way the communications I receive from those offices, I can change my preferred chosen name with campus records using the appropriate forms. And this process in some cases requires me to show a student ID or a government ID with my dead name in order to verify my identity. In most cases, the name change process does not include information about my preferred pronouns. There was very little information on the publicly accessible websites about what if there is a preferred pronoun statement process, or whether that's accessible to students and how they undergo that. So I should say for this, for University A, in this scenario, the formality of this chosen name process differs dramatically. Some of them are just changing your name through Brightspace or Moodle, and that's all that's accessible. And others have a process where you might have to go and speak with the registrar, et cetera, et cetera. Either way, the intention of this this choice, this direction that universities have gone, is to ensure that in most of the interactions that students have on campus, that I'm not dead named, with the exception of official university communications about records, enrollments, etc. So that's University A. So now we're going to shift to University B, which is the other direction that universities have taken. These universities also offer two distinct name change processes, one for legal name and one for chosen or preferred name. However, either of the two processes that students go through will result in a comprehensive name change across university systems. And that includes official academic records, diploma, financial documents, tax documents, etc. In this case, these forms, these chosen name change forms, include warnings about potential issues or consequences that students might face with the CRA, OSAP, future employers, about discrepancies between their legal name with the province and the name that's used on their official academic records. And students are responsible for resolving these issues. And in most cases, the name change then requires identification or identity verification using a piece of government ID. And I'll just comment that as far as the public-facing information is concerned, it would be unclear to students in most cases where government ID is used, how that student would verify their identity in the future if they wanted to change their name for a second time. One of the reasons that's a concern is that some of these universities recommend changing your name back to your legal name prior to graduation to ensure consistency between the name on your diploma and your official legal name. So just again, as an example of a student at University B, my current legal name is Eric Van Giessen. I now refer to this as my dead name. My chosen or preferred name is Taylor Van Giessen. At this university, I can change my name comprehensively with the university by completing the appropriate forms. But on the respective form, there's a disclaimer that states that this change may lead to issues with various non-university bodies, such as OSAP, CRA, and future employers, due to discrepancies between my legal name and the name on student transcripts, records, or tax statements. In all cases, any issues that come up are the responsibility of the student. And in some cases, this disclaimer includes a recommendation to change one's name back to one's legal name prior to graduation to avoid future difficulties. In some cases, this process involves a form that can be submitted online. In others, I'm required to visit a registrar in person. And again, I'll say in this instance, in both of these instances, the presumption of the student, unless otherwise stated on the website, is that these changes will effectively be comprehensive across their communications with the university. Some universities, again, provide detailed steps about what, okay, so you filled in this form, here's the next step that you have to do, et cetera, while others don't talk that through explicitly in the same place where the name change process is talked about. So I'm just going to highlight briefly some of the advantages and disadvantages of University A and University B in scenario 2. So in University A, where a student cannot change their official academic records without a legal name change, but can use a chosen name in campus records and systems, the advantage is that in most cases on campus, I will be addressed using the correct name. But my legal name remains the same, so I'm not going to have any issues with the CRA, OSAP, future employers, et cetera, when they refer to my transcript. The disadvantage is I will be dead named in any official university communications every time I enroll, every time I deal with financial services, and on my university transcript. In University B, where the chosen name change process comprehensively changes the name in all official academic records and campus records. The advantage is that I'll be addressed using the correct name in all university contexts, including classes, registrar's office, student financial services, enrollment processes, etc. The disadvantage here is that I might face issues now or in the future due to discrepancies between my legal and dead name and the name affiliated with my SIN, and the name affiliated with my SIN and the name on student records. To avoid this, I need to remember to change my name back to my legal or dead name prior to graduation. So just a few notes and considerations about these processes. In most cases, they're quite complex and use difficult legal jargon that's difficult to understand and has pretty potentially weighty consequences that might get mixed or missed amidst the complexity. I'm a TA who gives out assignments to students, so I know sometimes the comprehension on these things is not what we expect it to be. And a few university websites include useful FAQ or drop-down sections that they attempt to make the process more accessible using sort of plain language, especially the ones that sort of lay out a variety of different scenarios. However, the complexity of the policy can still make that quite difficult to understand or sort through. Regardless, from a student perspective, the fact that some universities allow comprehensive name changes without a legal name change and that some universities declare this as not possible is likely confusing to students. So if I'm a student at one university in Ontario who wants to change my name and I have a friend who has already undergone that process at another university and it's not the same process, or that student could do it and I can't, that is likely quite confusing for students. And then several really positive things, several university forms or processes include a referral process to a 2SLGBTQ specialty advisor who walks the student through this process and any risks or complexity associated with it. However, most universities don't have that kind of advisor available. And then I'll just reiterate as we begin to shift into the next part of the webinar that in all of these contexts, an effective communication or trigger system that updates the various offices and software databases about these changes is needed. And without that, the risk of dead naming is quite high within the students' interactions with all of the various different softwares that universities make use of and that students interact with on a day-to-day basis. And I'll briefly just comment on pronouns. So as I mentioned, there's lots of different reasons why students might want to change their names and gender markers, but for trans students, it might be really important for them to do that in order for their correct pronouns and name to be used within the classroom, within their interactions at their university. And even when name change and pronoun policies do exist, there might be barriers to students going through those processes, such as having to provide some kind of proof or medical documentation or legal documentation, forcing the student to have to sort of out themselves to untrained staff and potentially in spaces where others can overhear and might put them at risk. And so our recommendations in an ideal world is to allow students to change their gender or name markers without requiring proof of medical or legal intervention, to allow students to share their pronouns with the university, as well as allowing students to choose when their name, gender, and pronouns are shared with others in the university. A really important one is to provide education to registrar's offices, the staff on 2SLGBTQ inclusion. I would say also wherever your student ID office is, anywhere where students, particularly if there's multiple steps involved, getting a comprehensive name change done, training for those staff on 2SLGBTQ inclusion, including the impacts of microaggressions such as dead naming and misgendering, is really, really important. And then our last recommendation that some universities have adopted, which seems like the sort of best case scenario, is where registrar's offices operate as kind of one-stop shops where they maintain the responsibility of the changes to reduce the burden on students and reduce the number of steps required by students to comprehensively change their name and how they're and throughout the various different records and systems at the university. That's kind of all I have for today. I did want to just briefly share these questions with you just to, as you step away from the webinar today, to reflect on as you think about how your university might improve these name change processes and procedures, which might involve taking up some of the changes that Brock has implemented in their name change system. So thanks for listening to all of that detailed information. And I think we're going to take any questions if there are some before we move on.
Thanks, Eric. We do have one question. Was there anything found for retroactive name changes? For example, if a student graduates and transitions later and wants their documents such as diploma or transcripts to match their new identity?
I didn't look into that too much, but I do recall seeing several universities that offer a way for alumni to sort of go through and fill out a form that allows for a new diploma or a new transcript to be produced that has an updated name on it. I think many universities have that, even just if your last name changes and you want it to be updated, for instance, from a maiden name to a different name. Those processes already exist for students who don't fall under the 2SLGBTQ umbrella. So I think that process is already in place.
Thank you. Another question, was there a split between option A and option B universities, would you say?
I mean, from my just speculating, I think it's based on that advantage disadvantage list. So on the one hand, I think universities are prioritizing not getting students into trouble with future discrepancies between their records and saying, no, we actually really need your official name to be your legal name within our records so that those issues don't come up down the road. And on the other hand, I think universities are listening to students who are saying being dead named every time I interact and get an email from financial services is really impacting my well-being. And so I need a way to change that in order to have my day-to-day life at the university be a more giving me more opportunity to thrive. So I think that's the main split that I see between the two, and they both come with downsides, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Another question, any guidelines or suggestions on where to locate the proper information on best practices for name changes?
We were talking about that as we did this scan, whether we're in the right place to sort of offer those best practices. I think because we're not up to snuff necessarily with some of the legal background behind the choices that these universities have made, we'd need information from that in order to complete that kind of best practices recommendation. But it would certainly be useful as we undergo these discussions.
And certainly some universities here in Ontario and elsewhere have trans inclusion guides, so such as Brock, and there's clearly information there. I think if we put ourselves in the position of a student, where would they go and find it? How do they do that? And so if it's web-based, where might that be? Like what kind of links are bringing people? What's those connections? How do they find those things easily? So yeah, I'm just going to give maybe one other question. Let me see. Is there a way for us to emphasize to staff and faculty that have autonomy over identity is a human right? And how do we believe that this can be done by calling someone in rather than calling them out? So, Eric, do you have some thoughts on that? I can add some thoughts.
Why don't you start, Michael, and I'll think about it for a second.
Yeah, so certainly I think the ongoing conversations that we have and creating those social norms that happen, providing, faculty training, certainly is really important, and staff training. And so some of the work that we're also doing in Thriving is looking at, for example, the impacts of being dead named and, trying to ensure that, if people are feeling uncomfortable, giving them some of those tools. And even, for example, if you did call someone by their dead name, how do you apologize and move on, those kinds of things. So sometimes it's really, some of those interactional, relational kinds of things as well. Eric, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think just some of the research that or that's come out of thriving, or that thriving is based on in some ways, around microaggressions and the impacts of these kind of seemingly small things that we do in our day-to-day life that we so easily brush off as inconsequential, and the long-term studies of how those impact student wellness, mental health and well-being and academic success, and sharing some of that information with people, and saying like these small gestures and choices that we make in regards to using someone's chosen name and pronouns makes a significant difference to their success in these various different ways, and their health within this environment. It's not a small thing; it's a big thing that adds up over time, or small things that add up over time to a big thing. And so I think that conversation changes how we think about our day-to-day interaction with students that are already potentially getting dead named in spaces outside of their university environment, and making our university safe spaces for, or safer spaces for 2SLGBTQ students as much as possible.
Great, thank you. I am going to move us on to our colleagues from Brock. So let me just share my screen again, because I'm doing the slide for them, and then I will introduce everybody.
I can try
Thank
to
you,
talk
Eric,
about
so
some
much.
answers to some of the other questions as we go, if I can.
Yes, exactly. And we'll address some of them in text and look at maybe in the final Q&A as well. So welcome to Tania Melnyk, who is the Director of Enrollment Operations with the Office of the Registrar and Enrollment Services at Brock. So Tania is a proud Brock alumna who began her professional career at Brock in student recruitment, recruiting undergraduate students to call Brock their home for nearly 14 years ago, started that role. Throughout her career, Tania has directed and overseen the creation, implementation, and monitoring of programming, systems, processes, and structures that enhance student success and experience, faculty support, and staff development. Tania is passionate about developing workflows, procedures, and systems to optimize service and operational functions. Tania strives to foster a collaborative environment focused on efficiency, accuracy, and continuous improvement. Thank you for joining us, Tania. So next I have the pleasure of introducing Chelsea Takalo. Chelsea is an EDI and human rights organizational change specialist with over 20 years of experience in designing and delivering systems change initiatives based on equity, anti-oppression, trauma-informed practices, social justice, and human rights. Their work involves managing complex, large-scale, public-facing human rights concerns and facilitating restorative and transformative responses centered in cultural safety and collective care. Additionally, they've transformed schools and institutions through the co-construction, facilitation, reporting on multi-year EDI strategic plans, including professional learning, policy review and development, gathering of quantitative and qualitative stakeholder data, and community engagement events, programs, and campuses. And so great to have you with us, Chelsea. Thank you. And finally, we have Alba Kotyk. Alba has been working in information systems for 40 years, 34 of those years as a member of the Brock University's Enterprise Solution Department. The past 34 years have been marked with extreme changes in technology, all with the goal of improving staff and student experience. Thank you to our colleagues, and you can just let me know when you want me to go to the next slide.
On to the next. And you did the next one for us, so we can do on to the next.
Okay.
So greetings, everyone. My name is Chelsea. I'm currently the Associate Vice President of EDI. I came into Brock on a 6-month contract as the Director of the Human Rights and Equity Office in June 2022. So part of what brought us here is when I came into the role, I'm like, as it stands, I'm only going to be at Brock for 6 months. What's one thing that I can do or change that will make some kind of a long-term impact that's possible or plausible within that 6 months? So I did a scan through the policies and processes at Brock compared to other universities. And also being in the Human Rights Office, we manage all formal and informal complaints connected to human rights concerns. So I also asked about what are some of the trends based off of the last few years of different groups who are highlighting, systemic or institutional barriers connected to their lived experiences and identities. And one of the things that came forward was there was a variety of students who were reporting being dead named, going through some form of a name change process, being told they can or they could not by other people. Some that went through the process had their name changed in one place, but then it didn't change in any of the others. And so this was one of the things that I really zoned in on, is this is something that we could probably look at creating some structure around as we move forward together. So at that point, I reached out to the registrar, because through the scan, most of the institutions that do have forms sit with the registrar. And at that time, the registrar was actually looking through the process, looking into the process of creating a form to change names on diplomas specifically. And so through that conversation, we said, can we extend it to name changes, period, across campus? And they were very, very open to that. So through that process, we spoke to a variety of stakeholders in other registrar offices and other human rights offices to hear about some of the practices and processes that they had engaged in, and what's working in their spaces and what's not working in their spaces. So we could try to do our best, as we were just starting this process, a little bit behind some of the other institutions, as most of them did have some form of a name change process, to take some of the lessons that they learned. And one of the lessons that came up consistently across areas was that piece around the trigger systems, that names could be changed in particular areas, but it wouldn't translate across all of the areas in the institution where names needed to be changed, therefore resulting in dead names. So those are some of the pieces that brought us here, but also in the students that came forward to share their concerns with the Human Rights and Equity Office, they talked about a number of the things that Eric brought forward. So people needed some navigation support. They couldn't figure out who to talk to or where to talk to. They talked to people and they were getting different responses from different people. So they really identified a need in needing some navigation support. And others noted that, we needed some communication resolutions, because what was being communicated by one space was not being communicated with another space. And so that kind of brought us to the process that we engaged in. We can move to the next slide. So I talked through a bit of these pieces, but I think often in institutions, people think that things take so much time. And this is not me saying that things don't take so much time. There absolutely is institutional inertia in a variety of areas. But I think sometimes things like this, concrete tasks, can be achieved faster than people would assume. So just to walk you through our process, we started doing that needs assessment in about August. The registrar and myself said, who needs to be at the table in terms of making this work? And we identified we needed registrar, we needed the Human Rights and Equity Office folks, we definitely needed the ITS folks to think about how are we mapping out those triggers and where things need to go, as well as the VP admin who oversaw a variety of those needs. And we were able to set a meeting in August. Remember, I started in June. So we're talking about a 2-month turnaround to that first meeting. We talked through things. Everyone was supportive and on board. And so ITS took away, let's map out all of the areas where we would need to make these changes and figure out where these places would need to be updated. So at Brock, we had a variety of areas. For example, the students who live on residence have a specific area that does not necessarily speak to another one. The Brock Card office, the registrar, students who are in varsity, students who do sports and recreation. There's a variety of areas that don't necessarily speak to each other. So the ITS department mapped out all of those areas that were accessible to central systems. And that was completed by October 2022. And during that process, the registrar and the Human Rights and Equity Office were working together to create the actual name change form that was created. We took that form and then we did community consultations, of course, with community members across the campus. We explicitly connected with the GSA, which is a Pride Club at Brock, and some other programs that catered and supported trans, non-binary, and gender expansive students. And that was completed in October 2022, and we were basically ready to go. So we were able to soft launch the forum in January 2023, and we did a full launch this September. Moving on to the next slide. And before I hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Tania, I will also say some of the conversations around why the decisions are being made separately around the legal pieces, which we are also not experts are. At Brock, we do our best to use what would be considered best practices under the Ontario Human Rights Code. And we know that the code can engage in different practices that the legal or legislative body haven't necessarily caught up with. And so we really attempt to use best practices under the OHRC to guide the work that we want to do here. And I'll pass it over to Tania.
Thanks, Chelsea. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Hi, everyone. I appreciate all the background and sort of getting us to where we are today here at Brock, Chelsea. So thanks for that. One of the important things that we noted along the way is that Chelsea sort of highlighted for all of you that some of the students reported that information was being shared from different offices that was inconsistent. And so we really wanted to ensure consistency, continuity across the board, and have one location for all of the information to live about name change process for all students. Because what we also discovered throughout building this process is that there was a process for undergraduate students within the Office of the Registrar. There was a process for graduate students within the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, which is separate from the Office of the Registrar here at Brock. And so in developing this process, we also reached out to all of the individual units to say, we're asking that you kindly remove any information that you have developed on your own from your websites. We're going to house a complete FAQ, the form, everything students need to know, regardless of the type of student that you are, on the Office of the Registrar site. And we're asking if you could funnel students to the Office of the Registrar website for consistent information. And so that's what we did. So I just included a snapshot here. We do house this information, including the form and the FAQs involved with the student name change process under our forms and self-service area on the ORES website for students. It expands, and I believe I have on the next slide the link if anyone would like to explore further. Just another example, once they do expand that section, the form that Chelsea touched on is listed there. They can link directly to it. And there are about 5 to 8 frequently asked questions that we do receive from students about the name change process. And this has also served as a bit of a knowledge guide for other departments on campus as well. I also created some canned email responses that different units can send out if they're fielding any inquiries based off of the FAQs that we house on our website, just to streamline correspondence to everyone. You can please go to the next slide, Michael. That'd be great. Thanks. And so a lot of this work that Chelsea had started in summer of 2022 really developed the foundation for a lot of this. And then when I came into this seat, one enhancement that we wanted to look at was converting the PDF form for name change into a more AODA compliant version. So we moved that to Microsoft Forms this past summer, just before we had our full launch this fall. And so what this also allowed us to do was to streamline the process of how students wanting to make a legal name change could provide us their supporting documentation. And so I know Alba is going to talk a little bit about our student information system and the work that went into building the automated triggers. But we also have a part of the student information system here at Brock, which is a homegrown system where students can submit documents to us for various requests. That's also how they request, official enrollment letters and things of that nature from the university. So the advantage of the Microsoft form is that we could build branching right into the form. And that way, if a student told us they were wanting to change their chosen name only, great, they submitted the form, that gets sent to our records team and they can go into the student information system and make that change. If the student tells us on this form they want to make a legal name change, the form sort of concludes with information on how to upload the supporting documentation required to make that legal name change within the SIS. And so that really allowed for a bit more clarity for students to know that there was a bit of a different process depending on the type of name change they were wanting to make. And I believe that brings me to how we operationalize this in our student information system, which we call Brock DB here at Brock. And so I'll turn things over to my colleague Alba to walk us through that piece.
Good afternoon, everyone. In ITS, our task was relatively simple. The hard lifting was all done by Chelsea's group and Tania's group. Basically, we have a homegrown system, so we have staff that has a centralized area where we keep demographic information for students. We know all the integrations that we have coming in and going out of our system, and so we identified anything that had anything to do with a first name, last name, middle name, or preferred or common name, as we call it in our system. We identified all the integrations, found all the stakeholders, and just did a test because the integrations that exist should already push out any changes that happen without any notification or any interference required by the client of those areas. So I just went in and used my student number and put in a fake change of a name. Emailed the various groups, told them when my name change went in, and then I followed it through all the integrations and asked them to double check, and sure enough, everything flowed just fine. The biggest issue we had was with various groups around the university have micro IT areas where they mine data and create their own systems, and they're not typically upfront about it, so we don't know. But we were able to trace some of the data. So, and with 34 years at Brock, I kind of knew where some of the areas were. So I reached out to them and asked them if they stored information, found out how often they mine the data, et cetera, et cetera. I brought all that information back to Tania in the Reg office, and I said, here's all the outlier systems that are using student name that are not connected to our system. So we came up with a method that whenever the Reg office makes a change to the core demographic table in either of those four fields, first name, last name, middle name, or common name, we have a trigger set up and we have an email system set up so that depending on the type of student, if the student is a graduate student and in residence, then that student will appear on an email that goes out to the Graduate Studies office, or the Graduate Student Association, the GSA, and to residents. And there's a core group that gets all name changes just for oversight. So we've tailored it. So based on the type of student it is, we have some that are tailored based on course subject code because our computer science department has their own little system. So if the student is registered in a computer science course, we email that student over. We don't email every student that has a name change. We're very selective on who gets what. It's a need to know basis. And that's the extent of it. It's just a very simple trigger and email operation that we put into place to cover those areas that are outliers from our typical integrations. Yeah, I think this says this was basically it. The emails are set based on the status of the student. So computer science is a separate group, residents, undergraduate, these are all the ones that we've identified that would get separated students. So if I was an alumni and a Goodman student, I would be in those last two emails, but the residence people would not know that my name changed because they don't have a need to know. And our emails, the triggers, we didn't do an immediate trigger. So if a name changes, we don't immediately send the email out because, you know, sometimes there are those, you know, nanosecond oopsies where you make a change and you think, oh, shoot, I didn't mean to do that. So we selected twice a day. We send out these emails, we collect the changes and send them out to the various groups. That's just a scheduled task that can be changed if it needs to be more frequent or not. But so far, twice a day has been working for us. And that would be it. It was very simple.
Simple for Alba does not mean simple for everyone. Alba is our ITS support person who is knowledgeable on all things ITS. And sometimes when Alba speaks, I'm like, I'm just going to need you to explain that or break that down for me one more time. But especially, you know, if there are folks at your institution in ITS who have questions, Alba is just a wealth of knowledge and can make things sound easy that are not easy to everybody. Moving on to the next slide, Michael.
Okay, so this is just a sample. We have an email template. This is just a sample of the email that goes out. So depending on the group that's going to receive the email, and it's all table driven and controlled by the Reg office, they can add and change recipients at will. We provide the student number, we provide their campus ID, because those are two forms of identification and different systems use one or the other. They don't necessarily have the student number, some use only their campus ID. We identify the new name, so first, last. We didn't do middle, but we are triggering on middle, and common name. And then in the description at the end, we just identify which name or names were changed to make it easier for the person who's got to adjust their system.
And I'll just jump in here for a second. Alba had a great idea for this too. Myself and my colleague are copied on the emails that are sent out to all of the units that do need to make a manual change. And we've been following this through. So every day these come through my inbox. I spot check periodically and everything's been working out exactly the way we'd hoped. So it's been great, but it was a great idea to have some of the staff within the office of the registrar receive the change request emails as well, just to be able to follow through to make sure that everything's working appropriately.
Perfect. Next slide, Michael. And this is also to say, in no way, shape, or form does that mean everything runs smoothly. So for example, when we had our fall launch, one of the lessons learned is a number of students who are new incoming students, first cohort students, we're actually going to the Brock card office physically to request their physical Brock ID card before knowing about any of these pieces. And so when folks were going to the Brock card office, they were saying, I don't want the name that you have, I want to use a different name. And at that point in time, because there's a variety of students who work at the Brock card office, not all of them were aware of the process. And so some of them were being turned away, which thankfully they immediately came to the Human Rights and Equity Office. And we were able to reconcile that pretty quickly so that all of the staff who work within the Brock card office sort of in their area have a poster that explains the name change process. Emails are sent to all staff that work in that area at the beginning of each semester to remind them that students who are coming forward and requesting a name change for their Brock ID just have to go to the name change form through the registrar's office first. It takes a few days and then they can come back for an ID card that of course is not going to show their dead name, but that did take some troubleshooting for us as we were moving through it. Also, we, at the beginning of each semester, once in the orientation week or the week leading up to the beginning of the semester, and then once the third week of the semester, the Human Rights and Equity Office offers a name change process workshop that students can attend virtually or in person, just so they can get verbally walked through the process if they have questions or want support. And then we also put in place some support structures and mechanisms. So the Human Rights and Equity Office at Brock has two managers, one manager of EDI education, training, and outreach, and one manager of gendered and sexual violence, intake and support. And we also have 3 advisors. So we have a human rights advisor, an accessibility advisor, and an anti-racism advisor. All 5 staff are trained and able to walk students through system navigation, literally sit with them, go through the form online to support them navigating through that process. And we do that from an intersectionality lens, recognizing a Black trans student might feel more comfortable connecting with the anti-racism advisor to go through that work, or a non-binary student with a disability might feel most comfortable connecting with the accessibility advisor, but still want support. So we just make sure everyone in the office is able to offer that support to all students. It doesn't necessarily need to be funneled to one person, although the main point person is our manager of gendered and sexual violence intake support for systems navigation. In addition to that, we also found that a number of students did want to go through the legal name change process, but of course, for financial reasons, that piece was prohibitive to them. So Michael, we can go to the next slide. So we were also able to create in the last 12 months through the Human Rights and Equity Office, a gender affirmation fund and an emergency survivor fund, which is a separate conversation and a separate topic, which we'd be happy to explore as well. But the gender affirmation fund is set up. We have a $10,000 pot that sits in our office. It's administered by a funding committee that can receive requests for funding up to $1,500 for gender affirming supports. We don't have a list of eligible and ineligible items for the Gender Affirmation Fund because we recognize each person's needs are going to be entirely unique to each individual. And therefore, we don't have a list of eligible or ineligible items that are possible. Each student at any point in time can apply for up to $1,500 per year to a maximum of $4,500 during their time at Brock. And we assess these applications at the beginning of each month. There is no identifying information other than there is a student who is requesting this for this purpose. So that information is completely anonymous except for the one intake point, which is typically or traditionally the manager of gendered and sexual violence. And so through that process, we will fund if they want to go through the legal name change process or a variety of other processes that they might want access to. It's a funding base in order for us to support individuals as well. Next slide, Michael. That's it. Questions?
Thank you. Thank you all so much. This was great. I was nodding along as this is wonderful. And I can see some claps, some applauses, and some hearts. Are you okay if I stop sharing the screen? And before we conclude, I can bring up your email addresses and those things that are on that last slide. So, okay, we've got some questions going here. So welcome. Certainly one person is asking, are you willing to share the form, even in a PDF and Word version? Yep, great. We have another, approximately, how long did this system take to design and implement up to this point?
If you're talking about the trigger system at the database level and the emails that go out, because we own the code, it was very simple. You know, the trigger was maybe 2 hours of my DBA's time, and the email system probably a week's worth of development, but that's not heads down development. That was kind of, you know, we've got 3 people in the office, so it was on the side of your desk. So maybe I'd say start to finish after all the testing, maybe 3 weeks to get it into testing, into the registrar's office, hands for testing. And then when they were comfortable, we implemented.
Great, thank you. Did you experience any attitudinal barriers in implementing the system?
I'm happy to touch on that one a little bit. I think what was really key in this is Chelsea organizing all of the key players from the onset. And so we came together as a collective to really highlight the importance of this, why this was a challenge, the way that it was currently being operationalized, and why we wanted to make some of the changes that we were looking to make. And everyone has been extremely responsive. Everyone was very open to removing any information they had on their website so that they could funnel everyone to the Office of the Registrar Enrollment Services page. I think people generally understood that that also eliminated any duplication of efforts in terms of updating information. Now everyone knows we only have one spot. So if Chelsea's team communicates something to us in terms of a change in process or change in legislation that would impact any of that, we know that the one source of truth lives on our site. So we know that once we've updated there, everyone is looking at that same information. So people were generally on board and willing to work with us in terms of sort of piloting this, and then also sort of monitoring for the first couple of months really closely in terms of how the changes were flowing through.
And I would add to that, like for me, policy, legislation, risk, and liability are the best language you could speak in any institution. And so even at the onset, when the ask was going out, it started as the Ontario Human Rights Code requires us to protect individuals based off of their gender identity and expression. We have reports of dead naming, which would be considered a violation of the Ontario Human Rights Code, which then opens us up to potential human rights tribunal applications. Therefore, in order to prevent this moving forward, this is a simple process that we recommend putting in place. That's the onset, the very beginning. So normally when you're talking about risk and liability in an institution, you don't get a whole lot of pushback.
Mm-hmm. Highlighting the importance of that framing. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Another question. Often student health and counseling offices have their own systems. Is information communicated to those offices?
When you're talking about counseling, if you're talking about personal counseling, that's one of the systems within our SIS. It's a built-in component, so any name change automatically goes to that. And what was the other one?
Just health and wellness. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, health and wellness. Yeah, so that's another part of our system, so it would just automatically happen.
Right. Alba, there's a related question, which is, do your student record updates also trigger updates to the employee system for any students that may be also employed by the university? Do you want to take that one?
Our employee system is not, we do not push student information to the employee system, no. So they would, we use HCM part of Workday, so students can go in and change their name themselves on that as employees. They have full control over that.
Okay, great, thank you. There is a follow-up question about the time point that was raised earlier. So regarding the length of time, more so curious regarding the collaborative department work that went into getting all the offices from the registrar, ITS, human rights, faculties, and so on and so forth involved and on board, since this seems like quite a collaborative piece to get started. And I'm curious regarding what the challenges might have been in the process.
I know this is not the answer most people would expect or want to hear, but there was almost no challenges because the vice president admin became the main point of contact. One of the things that I did was had their executive director set the meetings for everyone. So when people receive an email from the VP admin that you're coming to a meeting at this time on these dates, people know that it's important for them to show up and that they're going to be committed through the process. That was one way of leveraging, the reality of a hierarchy and positional power and power structures within an institution. But I think because things, when it came from communications, everything went through the VP admin's office. It was fairly simplistic. And to be honest, everyone there really was on board. And even if people didn't understand the nuances and the complexities of why we were doing it, everyone understood that it needed to be done and that it would be helpful to students. And I really do believe that everyone who is at the table has students' best interests at heart. And so it really wasn't, it was just setting the meeting. How much time do people need to get task 1 done? Okay, 1 month, set the second meeting. How much time do we need to get task 2 completed? Then our final meeting. So it honestly really only took between August and October for us to do all of that collaborative groundwork together.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. This is a question from earlier, but I'm wondering maybe some of our panelists might have some thoughts as well. In what way or ways might pronouns be shared with administration, faculty, and other students if there was a preference for particular students? So it goes from that recommendation that we had.
I mean, I can speak, this might be implied in the question, but whether your databases at the universities allow for this or not, it would be situations where the student is approaching a registrar. In that instance, if if a colleague there, if you were turning to a colleague to discuss a student that was in front of you, are you using the right pronoun in order to do that? Is there somewhere in the database that presents that to you so that you're not making an assumption about the gender of the person who's talking to you? Instead, you can look and check that and then use that in your references in that space. I think in terms of faculty or TAs, I'm a TA, it would be helpful in the room. We already do this a little bit, some of us asking for names and pronouns, but to have that written down already on a document would be really helpful in order to accurately use pronouns in the classroom. In terms of with other students, I think that demonstration by the TA is a really important starting place so that people don't have to do that self advocacy on their own. Again, that would be adding something like a pronoun option to class lists. Whether that's possible or not within those databases, you'd have to ask other people. But it would be helpful, particularly for students for whom using the correct pronoun is very important for them to be able to put that information forward is important.
Absolutely. Chelsea, I'm wondering if you have anything you want to add, given your work in the Human Rights Office and the work your colleagues have been doing.
So this would not be systems based, but of course, in the Human Rights and Equity Office, we actually today are recording micro-learning seminars, but we've also reached out to a variety of campus stakeholders. August and September, we call training season. Literally the entire office, almost every day, is doing training for some staff or faculty. So making sure that we're integrating pieces on gender identity, gender expression, the impact of misgendering, and the importance of using pronouns are always integrated into general EDI workshops, as well as, of course, there are faculties in areas of the institution that request specific trainings on gender identity and gender expression, which we curate connected to the ask. So for example, if recreation reached out to us and are like, we want a specific session on gender identity and expression to support the summer camp leaders, making sure they're aware of things like change room, washroom usage, all of those things, then it would be curated from that lens to support. Micro-learning we find is really, really successful and useful. And so we've also done some videos that we can send to faculties, and they've also embedded some of those videos or little micro-learning information on things like misgendering or pronoun usage into things like the provost newsletter that goes out to all faculty. So that's something, if it's short and it's small and it's probably going to take someone 5 minutes to listen to or read, they're much more likely to engage with that reading. And so that's also embedded in the provost information that goes out that we support in curating and providing recommendations on as well. And lastly, we do institutional wide, we call them equity dialogues once a month. So the equity dialogues all have a different focus, and they're open to everyone in the entire institution, student, staff, or faculty. So they all have different identity-based focuses per month. At the beginning of the month, the Brock News sends out either a video or a short article to read. People have a month to read them. And at the end of the month, we have an open space where any student, staff, or faculty can come and have critical dialogue around the resources that we send out. Again, recognizing that's not going to reach everyone. And it's often people who are committed and interested in furthering conversations around those issues. But it's another platform in order to try to get educational opportunities out there.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. I was wondering how long the micro were, and you said about 5 minutes, so really accessible, that's for sure. Yeah, great. Thank you. Another question, again, maybe anybody on the panel might want to take this one. Should a chosen name change process include chosen last names, or is the expectation that the chosen names are limited to first and middle names? Tania, I'm wondering maybe from the registrar's office, you might have a perspective.
Currently, we only capture for first or middle. And I believe that came out of discussion that Chelsea's office had with our university legal counsel in terms of, some of the challenges that might present. So we currently only allow that for chosen first name or middle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Eric, do you remember universities that allow changes for legal name, last name without legal name change?
Not off the top of my head. I think the majority of them were first and middle only.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly I can say in interactions with students, that's what we're talking about, right? In that way, most oftenly, for sure. So yeah. Another Brock specific question. Have there been discussions at Brock to allow chosen or preferred name on a diploma?
I'm happy to take that one. We do allow a chosen name for students on their diploma when they submit their intent to graduate through our student information system. There is a spot for them to outline how they'd like their name printed on their diploma. We do have a disclaimer for students, though, that if they elect to do that and it is different from their legal name, they may experience challenges with future employment, immigration, things that you may be required to present a copy of your diploma for, but we do allow students to do that as long as they understand if it's different from their legal name, they may experience potential future challenge.
Great, thank you. I was wondering also, as you roll this out in terms of support to the registrar's office and such, in terms of dealing with questions, was there, questions coming from students? Was there training provided to support in terms of how to, respond and work with students? Or is that because again, you gave that image of the student card office and then, intervening there, which is really important, but I'm sure students also might even just go to the registrar's office, and being the primary place that has the responsibility, is wondering.
Mm-hmm. We, when we confirmed this process and rolled everything out, and Chelsea's team and others understood what we were going to be doing and where everything was living online. We have monthly Office of the Registrar Enrollment Services meetings with all units across the ORES. And so I did present the changes about this process. We walked every team through the form, how to direct students. It was particularly helpful as well for our recruitment and admissions functions as well, just because, the process is a little bit different once you become a registered student or current student at Brock. So we did want to highlight some of that for the different teams that might be fielding questions. And that's where we also talked about sharing those canned email responses that I created internally for our own team, so that, whether it's our Brock Central team or frontline service hub that's receiving the inquiry, or one of our academic records staff members, recruitment, admissions, any of those units, everybody had the same bank of canned replies they could use, so that everyone was communicating in a consistent way with all students.
Great. Yeah, and that consistency is so important, I can imagine. Yeah. And then I guess when people are coming on, new staff, they're somewhat addressed in the onboarding process, I assume. So great, thank you. Another Brock specific question: does Brock permit diploma reprints for students who need to change their diploma name back to their legal name at a later date? And if so, is it free?
So I'm going to go no to free, but, and this is the same as the things that we navigated for students who wanted to change their Brock ID card. It also costs to reprint an ID card. And so again, through that gender affirmation fund, we will pay or cover the costs as long as the student submits a request. We actually this year just had a running list at the Brock Card office because of the volume. So we said if a student is requesting a name change based off of gender identity or gender expression or express that it's a dead name, they had our, like, we actually just had a process where they took the students' names instead of going to us. And at the end of that term, they sent us back the list of student names, and then we paid out the cost to the Brock Card office. And it would be the same thing in the question that you were talking, the question that you were asking about. And it also doesn't have to be paid, like the student doesn't have to pay and then we reimburse them. So as long as they get referred to our office, we can use our internal channels, mechanisms, P cards, etc., to pay it at the onset. That's the same thing for legal name changes. Like we will actually insert the payment as they're submitting the applications. So it's not free, but they can go through a process to get financial coverage for it.
Great, great. I guess one last question I have, and then we can, there was one other question in the chat I'll get back to, but any lessons learned, anything, if you say if we were going to do this differently, what might it be?
I don't necessarily, if we're at the point because we're so new, this is so brand new, to say what would we do differently. But I think with every, population, community, as things evolve and emerge, change, so do needs. So needs change over time. And so I think for us, we consistently do our best to listen to our community stakeholders, build relationships with identity-specific student organizations and clubs to make sure we're listening to the needs and making adjustments as needed when students are reporting barriers or concerns. I think the most important part is being responsive to what folks are identifying as barriers.
Great. Tania, anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so at this point. I think it's just been really good food for thought as we think about, potential enhancements to the student information system, potential system changes down the road. Alba and I have had a lot of good dialogue about what pieces do we really need to keep at the forefront as we look forward to what changes might be, just to make sure that some of these sort of intricacies are addressed and that they're not forgotten about as we work through different enhancements in the future.
Thank you. And Alba, anything you'd like to add in terms of things to do differently?
Not really. Just that ITS at Brock, we have a support role, pure and simple, and whatever the community needs from us, we do our best to help out. We have a very good working relationship with our departments. So we have very small staff, but we do our darndest.
Sounds like that for sure. Doing our darndest. Great. Thank you. A very big thank you to you for sharing your experience. This, I think, was when I first heard about this in our coordinators group. We thought we really wanted to learn from this. And so there's a lot of big important takeaways. So thank you for that. There was a question in the chat about some of the data that Eric had presented, looking at comparative numbers versus percentages for cisgender and trans students, because in some of the findings in the slides, we presented some numbers and versus others, I think, in percentages. We have certainly a more detailed report, which we can share with folks. That's report number 3 in on our web page. It's about policies and services on campus. Some of the specific data is there. Eric, you want to take the question though? Oh, your mic is off.
Oh, no, I was just marking that you were answering it. I think you're better.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yes. Okay. And I just hopefully am just posted the link to that particular report as well. Yeah, I do think in the slide we actually say X percentage of the number of students who answered the question, because we did have a different number of respondents for particular questions. So yeah, so thanks. So in terms of our colleagues at Brock, in terms of some follow-up information and email addresses and such. So thank you for sharing this and the form, and we will send out our slides. So you will have the link in the form and such, but if you wanted to grab a screenshot, feel free. And again, a big thank you to Chelsea and Tania, and for Alba for sharing today, and a big thank you to Eric. Really, really appreciate it. I also want to acknowledge our funders, which the original project was funded by the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada. We also have funding and support from Laurier's Cleary Center, also from the Division of Student Affairs, from my faculty here in the Faculty of Social Work, the Manual Life Center for Community Health Research, and also our Office of Research Services funded the original Connection grant, and we've recently received some additional funds from Research Services to keep some of this work going. We are at the last stages. We're hoping to have possibly 1 or 2 webinars coming up in June, so you will hear information about that. And it's actually tied to a special issue of a journal that we, the Thriving on Campus team, led, which brings together a great collection of articles, but also some best practice models and innovative practices. And we did not originally plan to do a webinar around the special issue. However, we know that we want to have access to these ideas, and so we thought that would be a great way to do it. So we're just in the early planning stages of looking at that. But again, hopefully during Pride Month, we might be able to have that opportunity. So a big thank you to everybody for joining us today. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments, and we will follow up with the PowerPoints, and also when the video is ready online, we'll let you know to everybody who registered today. So thanks again. Have a great rest of the day. Bye for now.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.